All right, let's dive into a fascinating puzzle. We're going to look at this not as a question of faith, but as a question of forgery. Think of it like a cold case investigation into what some have called a potential grand deception.
So here's the big question we're tackling today. What would it actually take to just make up the story of Jesus? I mean, could it really be the single most successful, most elaborate hoax in all of human history? Let's dig in and see what the argument is.
Okay, so if this was a conspiracy, where would you start looking? Well, you'd start with the conspirators, right? The guys who supposedly pulled it off and spread the story. And that means we're talking about the apostles.
And right away, you hit a pretty major snag. Look at this. On one side, you have who these guys actually were. Fishermen, a tax guy, regular laborers. But on the other side, you have the job description for faking this story. According to the argument we're exploring, this wasn't just any job. This group of, let's be honest, blue-collar workers would have needed to be moonlighting as some of the most brilliant theologians and writers on the planet.
And we're not just talking about being generally smart. No, the argument here is that they'd need a very specific, almost impossibly high-level skill set. We're talking about deep knowledge of obscure prophetic scrolls, super advanced rabbinic interpretation techniques, and the ability to write in high-level literary Greek. I mean, this is PhD-level stuff. This is the kind of thing you'd need a whole team of elite scholars to pull up.
But okay, let's just say for a second that they were all secret geniuses. Well, the argument points out an even bigger problem, a huge logistical hurdle. They didn't have access to the source material. You have to remember, back in the 1st century, these sacred scrolls weren't like books in a public library. Access was completely locked down. It was restricted to the absolute elite, the priests, the scribes, the super wealthy. The apostles, they were fishermen from Galilee. They were total outsiders. You couldn't just, walk into the temple library and check out the book of Isaiah for some light reading.
And this quote from the source really says it all. The idea that Peter studied Isaiah 53 on his lunch break is historically absurd. It just paints the picture, right? It's presented as a total fantasy. These scrolls were priceless, they were guarded, and they were way, way out of reach for regular folks.
And this wasn't just our modern interpretation. This is exactly how the religious authorities at the time saw them. They weren't even considered rivals worth debating. They were just dismissed out of hand as, uneducated peasants from some backwater town in Galilee. The idea that this group could invent something theologically profound was laughable to them.
Okay, so the accomplices seem pretty unlikely. That brings us to the next piece of the puzzle. If the apostles were the crew, who was the mastermind? The argument now shifts its focus to the alleged ringleader of the whole fraud, Jesus himself.
And to analyze this, the source uses that classic framework you've probably heard of, the liar, lunatic, or Lord trilemma. We're going to focus on the first two options, liar and lunatic, and look at them from a purely logical, almost psychological point of view.
So, first up, what if he was a liar? A brilliant con man? Well, according to this argument, to pull that off, Jesus would need two completely contradictory personalities, both operating at a genius level. On the one hand, you need the mind of a world-class philosopher to come up with teachings that are so profound and consistent. But on the other hand, you'd need the mind of a master manipulator to deceive everyone around you. The argument is that these two psychological profiles just don't exist in the same person. They're like oil and water.
And even if you get past the psychology, you run into a logistical nightmare. Just think about it. To make the whole story work and fulfill prophecies, he would have had to control an insane number of variables that were completely out of his hands. I mean, things like the political pressures on Pontius Pilate, the infighting within the Sanhedrin, getting Judas to betray him at the perfect moment, even down to making sure Roman soldiers would gamble for his clothes. It's not just a lie at that point, it's a conspiracy on a scale that's almost unimaginable.
All right, so if liar is a tough sell, what about lunatic? Maybe he just genuinely believed he was God, but was, crazy. Well, this is where the argument hits another wall, and that wall is the teachings themselves.
The point here is that the teachings show a mind that is the polar opposite of disordered. Think about the multi-layered parables, the perfectly balanced ethical systems, the way he sets these flawless logic traps for highly trained rabbis who are trying to trick him. The content is described as structurally perfect and psychologically brilliant. That's just not what you get from a madman.
Okay, this next part gets a little more abstract, but is maybe the core of the whole argument. We're zooming out from the people involved and looking at the blueprint itself, the structure of the Bible, which is presented as maybe the ultimate proof that it couldn't have been forged.
The source calls this idea the multi-genre verification matrix. Now, that's a mouthful, but the concept is actually pretty straightforward. The idea is that the Bible isn't just one book. It's a whole system of interlocking books from different genres. You've got prophecy, history, personal letters, and they're all designed to connect with and verify each other across hundreds of years.
And this system is broken down into 4 distinct layers, with each one doing a very specific job. You've got prophecy, then historical fulfillment, then doctrinal explanation, and finally, a layer for future verification. Let's take a look at how this matrix supposedly works.
So here's how it's laid out. Layer 1, the Old Testament, makes all these specific testable predictions. Think of it as setting up the pins. Layer 2, the Gospels and Acts, comes along and acts as the historical record, claiming to document how those pins were knocked down. Layer 3, the letters from Paul and others, is like the real-time commentary, discussing what just happened. And then you have the 4th layer, Revelation, which sets up new prophecies for the future, creating a final check that, by its very nature, couldn't be faked by the original authors.
And this brings us back to those fishermen. To invent a system this complex, this interlocking, well, as the source puts it, the apostles would have needed to be better biblical scholars than the rabbis, better writers than the Greeks, and better prophets than Isaiah. They'd have to be masters of everything, all at once.
And remember, we're not talking about one lone genius. The whole hoax theory rests on the idea that 13 guys, Jesus and his 12 disciples, all shared the same simultaneous superhuman intelligence. 13 of them.
So where does all of this leave us? Well, the argument concludes by reframing the whole debate. It says this isn't a choice between a miracle and a simple, rational explanation. It's actually a choice between 2 different kinds of miracles.
The main takeaway is this. You don't actually eliminate the miracle by rejecting the story. You just replace it. You're forced to believe in a different kind of miracle, one that might be even harder to swallow.
And here they are, the 2 miracles you have to choose between. On one side, you have the divine miracle. The story is true as written. But on the other side, you have the human miracle, that a handful of untrained, uneducated peasants with zero access to the source material somehow managed to create the most complex, coherent, and influential literary masterpiece in all of human history, all while being hunted and persecuted. And not one of them ever cracked and admitted it was all a lie.
So the argument just leaves us with that one last question. When you really weigh the evidence, when you look at all the logistical and psychological hurdles, which of those 2 stories actually requires the bigger leap of faith? Which one is truly harder to believe?